Suffering. So today, I want to interview our brother who's an attorney, brother Hakeem Muhammad. He's also the founder of Black Dawah Network. Uh, so the brother Hakeem uh, Esquire, right? Be the right title. Tell me a little bit about yourself and your career.
Sure. So I'm an attorney. I describe myself as an attorney that works on behalf of Black America, particularly focused on protecting the human rights of Black Americans living in the hood, in the inner cities. And it's a real honor to appear on this program. And I thank you, brother, for inviting me. So I've done legal work on behalf of prisoners' rights, especially with African American Muslims who are struggling with the correctional facilities across America who repeatedly abuse their rights. I've also done work in police brutality litigation, as well as criminal defense. I work in the racial justice litigation unit, where I work to pioneer as well as formulate different legal arguments to challenge the impact of structural racism on African Americans in criminal trials. So that's what I do as an attorney.
How long you been in the field now?
Well, I've been a practicing attorney for a little over 2 years now. Before that, I did various internships at different organizations in different areas of law.
Where do you go to law school?
Northeastern Law School here in Boston.
MashaAllah, that's good. That's good news. It's good to see our peoples into the legal system to help others. What did you study in law?
So one particular area of interest is how structural racism maintained itself even after the removal of Jim Crow laws, even after the removal of explicit laws that discriminated against Black people, how structural racism against Black people continued. I'm interested in just the entirety of the African American legal tradition, African American legal thought, how African American attorneys have sought to use the legal system to challenge racism, critiques of that method, etc.
Tell me, so what's some of the challenges for African Americans in the legal system in the West?
Well, I would, in terms of one of the major challenges is in terms of the ability of civil rights legislation or even civil rights laws to really do anything meaningful as far as redressing racism or discrimination against Black people. It's really, really limited. There's been many instances where, and different, African American legal scholars have discussed this, where different, even laws that were passed supposedly to benefit Black people or to fight against structural racism, purportedly for those purposes, end up instead being used to further white supremacy, to further white nationalism. So for example, one example of this is they've actually now used various states have now used like the equal protection law of the United States to say that critical race theory should not be taught in school. So they've used the United States Constitution to essentially critique African American critiques of structural racism. So I mean, that's just one of many examples.
Yeah, you have tell us a little bit about critical race theory, because you have a lot of Muslims who are actually against critical race theory being taught. You have some YouTubers, Saj Liphan, Daniel Hachikachu. I have noticed that they've been pushing hard against critical race theory. I don't know why they're talking about that topic, because they're not Black themselves, but they're promoting it. It also appears in some of the YouTubers from on the Muslim side. You have some Muslim YouTubers who support the far right agenda. So can you tell us a little bit about CRT and
Yeah, sure. So I'm familiar with some of these critiques of critical race theory. I don't subscribe to the belief that you necessarily have to be Black or "You Not Being Black" sort of delegitimizes a critique of critical race theory. But certainly, the majority of the people who are engaging in these critiques of critical race theory have not the slightest clue as to what they are talking about. So, critical race theory, it developed. It's when you talk about critical race theory, you're talking about a large chunk of African American legal scholarship about structural racism against Black America post Jim Crow. So that name is essentially what is like a post facto term to describe a large body of scholarship by African American legal scholars who are critiquing structural racism post Jim Crow. So, for example, the attorney Derek Bell, he helped litigate the Brown versus Board of Education decision that got civil rights, that purportedly held that separation, that being separate but not equal, that schools, that overturned school segregation, that mandated that Black and white people attend integrated schools. He helped to litigate those cases. And later in the 80s, Derek Bell he's coming to the conclusion that African Americans are still living they're still attending segregated schools. Their schools are still of an inferior quality than that of white schools. And so he does an analysis as to how school segregation continued. And over time, just that body of scholarship that looked at how structural racism manifested itself post Jim Crow, it eventually acquired the name critical race theory. So when you're talking about critical race theory, you're talking about a large body of African American scholarship to address structural racism against African Americans post Jim Crow. I haven't seen any compelling evidence that that critical race theory is in any way oppositional or antagonistic to Islam. It does not. So critical race theory does not address issues related to the purpose of life, why we were created. It's not it's not putting forth theological claim. This legal scholarship addressing structural racism against Black America post Jim Crow.
All right, because some people are trying to connect the LBGQTI agenda to the critical race theory, and they're saying that is what is problematic about CRT.
So, I mean, there would have to be some. Critical race theory is dealing with exactly that, structural racism against African Americans post Jim Crow. It's dealing with the failure of Brown versus Board of Education to do away or to eradicate structural racism. It's dealing with the failure of equal protection laws to really give African Americans meaningful equality in America. And it's a fact, you hear all these people who are critiquing liberalism. Critical race theory is a critique of liberal efforts to redress structural racism in America. It's arguing that liberalism, that liberal ideals about equality are in America and their legislative system are insufficient to address structural racism. Are there scholars in critical race theory who in the alternative or may promote LGBT in their scholarship? Certainly. But the core of what critical race theory is about does not address that issue really at all.
All right, because there's a lot of there's a lot of people, especially our peoples. Our peoples, unfortunately, Black Americans, Muslims. I'm
sorry, brother. So there are Muslim academics who engage in critical race theory scholarship. As well as analysis, just like you may have some left-wing people with more socialist ideas who also engage in it as well. But the core tenets of critical race theory, how structural racism maintained itself post Jim Crow, the failure of civil rights legislation to redress structural racism, those are the core tenets of critical race theory, and I don't see any compelling evidence as to how they would contradict Islam at all.